Senate Democrats are again talking about pushing for a Supreme Court ethics bill, this amid new revelations about several sitting associate justices, including Samuel Alito. Justice Alito was secretly recorded by a liberal filmmaker who was pretending to be a Catholic conservative at an off-the-record event held at the High Court earlier this month. The two were discussing whether it was possible for ideological opponents to find compromise. The audio was later posted on social media. Here is part of what Justice Alito said.
One side or the other is going to win. I don't know. I mean, there can be a way of working, a way of living together peacefully, but it's difficult, because there are differences on fundamental things that really can't be compromised.
In the recording, Alito also said he agreed when the filmmaker said people needed to keep fighting to, quote, return our country to a place of godliness. Renee Knake Jefferson joins us now. Renee is a professor of law at the University of Houston Law Center. She is also the author of the book Law Democratized. Professor, it's great to have you with us. Thank you for joining us. So there is this conversation going on in Congress, one that I really haven't seen before, which sounds muscular about what Congress can do to regulate the ethics of the Supreme Court. What are the authorities Congress does or doesn't have in this space?
Well, Congress certainly has oversight authority to step in. We're seeing headlines like the clips you just played and information about the release of the justices' financial disclosures last week, because right now, frankly, we have a Supreme Court that's operating without consequences. And Congress needs to step in and provide oversight. The real question is whether Congress can act in a bipartisan way to do so. Right now, there's a bill being considered that would, for example, place caps on the amount a gift could be that a justice receives, limiting it to $50, for example. Congress could also require that the Supreme Court have an ethics code with consequences. The court did, to be fair, adopt an ethics code last fall, but it doesn't require anything of the justices. And if a justice is perceived to be acting in a partial or biased way by a party or the public, there's no mechanism right now for an individual to complain about that or for the justice's decision not to recuse to be reviewed. Those are all things that Congress could step in and require. Of course, the Supreme Court could also adopt those kinds of provisions to govern itself, but so far it's declined to do so.
And on that point, Professor, quite separate from what Congress can or can't do or whether it can assemble a bipartisan majority to move forward on any of these initiatives, is there any sense, based on your research and looking at available public data and polls on this, that the Supreme Court, whether it intends to or not, has sort of lost the plot when it comes to public confidence and ethics credibility?
Indeed, I think that's exactly what's happening. Polls bear it out. And frankly, I think this is also what we're seeing with the kind of reporting that's happening surrounding the court. We have now entered a world where, and not to knock journalists, but we have journalists who are effectively acting as the measure for whether or not our Supreme Court is adhering to any sort of ethics related to both the gifts they receive and ways that they might be either perceived to be biased or actually biased and influenced to favor a particular party before them. The court should be administering guardrails itself, but instead we're left for journalists to do that. And I think the public sees this now, that it's a real problem. And increasingly, the public is paying more and more attention, which is why, to your point, they are losing confidence in the integrity of the court.
And the considerable amount of reporting done on gifts received by Justice Clarence Thomas seems to attract disproportionate attention because they are disproportionately large, are they not?
Well, that's true. Certainly, he has received the most number of gifts, I think both in terms of quantity and certainly in terms of financial value. And that's part of why they're attracting attention. I think another reason why they are getting extra scrutiny is that they haven't been disclosed in a timely manner. And in fact, it was only after reporting from ProPublica last year that we saw last week Justice Thomas now declaring two trips that happened back in 2019. So that's yet another example where the public is seeing that the court isn't operating on its own under ethics rules in the way it should. Instead, we're relying on journalists for it to happen, and that compromises the reputation and the integrity of the court.
Professor, how should the public evaluate the inability of Chief Justice John Roberts to find a way to appear before Senate Democrats who've asked him to appear before the Judiciary Committee? He's citing separation of powers issues. I mean, if they can't even talk about this in one manner or one form or another, is this just inevitably and perpetually stalled?
Well, I think the public should be pretty skeptical about the Chief Justice's lack of willingness to even have a conversation with members of Congress. When we talk about separation of powers, of course, to be sure, we want a judiciary that is functioning independently. Congress could not, for example, pass legislation that would allow it to decide cases on the merits instead of the Supreme Court. That said, an important part of separation of powers is also the checks and balances that each branch of government places. And Congress has an important role here to play where things seem out of whack at the Supreme Court, and they need to step in.
Professor Renee Knake Jefferson, thank you so much for your time.